Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Kevin McDonough, an advisory systems engineer at Dell Technologies. Now, Kevin, before break, you were listing all the problems in the world. You made us scared. I don't want to turn on my computer now. I don't want to go on my cell phone. Luckily, we know that there are some solutions to this problem, and it's not all about building a higher wall or building a better gate. It's really about you mentioned defense in depth approach. So what does that look like? What can agencies do today, and what's some of the longer term goals?
Yeah, it's not all doom and gloom. We do have to understand that it's probably gonna, we're probably gonna declare a cyber event, and not declare the disaster recovery event. I mean, that's just the way things are. So if we kind of look at the tools that have been around forever, like the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, which is just a way to identify the steps that an adversary has to take in order to have a successful campaign. The good news is, we're getting better at, stopping those attacks earlier to the beginning, towards reconnaissance. But now we have tools where ultimately, because we've segmented the value of the data, our really valuable data, the crown jewels that I mentioned before, we are preventing the adversaries from getting to command and control through isolation and through advanced immutability. So at the end of the day, even if we haven't patched anything, even if one of our users clicks on the wrong thing, we can stop every single attack at that command and control phase, which means the adversaries can never take action on their objectives, and we win. So that to me is the good news. Instead of getting bogged down by the absolute complexity, the size of the issue, really kind of break it down to ultimately, where can I stop them? What simple things can I do to protect my critical data? And again, beyond federal organizations, the small mom and pops, where to be honest, as I mentioned before, Jason, it's an existential question. How do I keep my doors open in order to stay in business? And, from a government perspective, I don't want to be that agency, right? You said it before. I don't want to be the first. So I think that's the good news. There's guidance from CISA, guidance from NSA, guidance from the FBI, the corresponding European agencies. And it really comes down to, let's just isolate our critical data, separate it from the networks, set up a physical separation and then a logical air gap separation, if you will, so that we know that there's no way the adversaries can get to that critical data. But then again, it goes to what we've been talking about, defense in depth. You don't want to put all of your data in that isolated enclave. You just want to, save that for the critical stuff. And that honestly is where the hard discussions come in. Because if you asked a business owner, they're going to say, my stuff's the most valuable thing in the organization. So that's where leaning on somebody who's done this a lot, understands a business impact assessment, understands.
You bring up a very interesting point about the understanding the business impact. And I think we should go down that path a little bit.
Okay.
It's one thing to say, here are my crown jewels, but if everything's a crown jewel, then nothing is a crown jewel.
Correct.
So what are you seeing when you talk to agency customers? How do you help them? What advice do you have to say, okay, how do you take that step back and say, this database is more important than that database, and this is why? How are you helping agencies do that?
Yeah, we come back. It really, in many ways, it's akin to a workshop. But what we've done, and internally we call it a critical rebuild list. It's a list of things that are derived from historical data, from past attacks. So again, I go to NotPetya. Maersk had their data; they didn't have DNS. Well, that's certainly something we want to have in the vault. Intellectual property, infrastructure, the network diagrams, all of those different things. That's the list of what we call a critical rebuild that we always suggest, organizations start here. That's, at a minimum, start protecting those kinds of things so we can recover from an attack. And then let's peel back the onion and understand what are those critical things. And to be honest with you, Jason, it's a phased approach, right? That start off with that critical stuff, and then they understand the capabilities and the protection it provides. it becomes very, very clear. So if an organization already has a business impact assessment done, if they've already done disaster recovery tests, those kinds of things, they're very far along the way in terms of identifying what data needs to go into that isolated environment.
Are you finding that as agencies and OMB required agencies to identify their high value assets, they're better at this conversation? Or again, are you finding the opposite, that they think everything's high valued?
I think their initial knee-jerk reaction is everything's of high value, but they're getting better at it for sure. The one thing I think they struggle with is the legacy systems, where patches aren't available, but they still provide a critical aspect to that particular agency's capabilities, what they're supposed to do, like DoD supporting a mission. So that's where the difficulty comes in, where it doesn't fit into an easy place. I can't use modern tools to be able to protect that data. But that, once they do the knee jerk, everything needs to go in. We take a step back when, as you said, we define if everything's important and nothing's important. Their cheeks turn red, they get a little embarrassed, and then we can start forward.
When I talk to CIOs and when I talk to the CISOs and the federal agencies, I think they like to talk a lot about what their high value assets are and how they're identifying them and how they're protecting them. But then it kind of comes back around to this idea of, well, it's up to the business side, it's up to the business needs, and,
right.
and then we're really depending on them. So I think, again, going back to what you said earlier, it really does take that partnership to get it done. You mentioned the one misconception is that if everything is important, nothing's important. And then the other misconception is trying to understand kind of that separation that's needed. You can't just protect everything. What are some of the other misconceptions you see as you hear from agencies?
Yeah, so my pet peeve misconception is really kind of made up of 3 different components. So I'll kind of go through it. Again, it's based on the fact that from a data protection standpoint, we've utilized the venerable 3-2-1 model for forever, right? 3 copies, 2 different media types, 1 offsite. So really what I'm seeing agencies and other people is they're adding to one of those different components, right? I'm going to have more than 3 copies. I'm going to have more than 2 different types. I'm going to make sure my disaster recovery is more secure, but they're really not addressing ultimately what needs to be done. So, again, in line with what CISA, FBI, all of them say, you need to add another one. So I always tell organizations, to protect our modern, to protect ourselves from the modern attack surface, it's a 3-2-1-1. We can't reutilize, we can't retool, things that we've done before. One of those big things is the term immutability. This gets me wrapped around the axle, if you will. Immutability by definition means it can't be changed, right? It can't be modified in any way, shape, or form. But if we understand that any tool, whether it's a platform, software, what have you, if it's in production, it is ultimately vulnerable. Yes, or things are harder to break down. Yes, we can set up defense in depth, multi-factor authentication, all of those different things. But we just have to say, and we just have to understand, if it's in production, it's vulnerable. Immutable storage in production doesn't exist. It has to be coupled with something else. And again, this is just my humble opinion, but if it's coupled with isolation, if it's coupled with roles and access and all of those different things, now we're cooking with gas. Now we do have advanced immutability. We are able to meet the requirement and definition of what immutable is. It can't be changed, it can't be modified, deleted, altered in any way, shape, or form. So if I look in an attack, that's ultimately what I want to revert to. But if I'm, if it's data protection recovery aspect, that's where immutable technology in the production environment is perfect. I'm not poo-pooing it. I'm just trying to understand. My pet peeve is to cap its capabilities. It's not going to be the tool to protect you from a catastrophic attack, right? Because at the end of the day, it's vulnerable. The other one is, people out deciding that if I just do a metadata kind of crawl from a observation standpoint, or if I set thresholds, I'm going to be protected. That to me is insanity. Threshold setting is ultimately, at the end of the day, an art form. You really need to implement a tool that's going to look for actual indicators of compromise, actual indicators that an adversary is in your environment, actual indication that adversaries have somehow encrypted your data, changed the extension, done all of those different things. That's ultimately the tool that needs to be done and coupled with the isolated data. So now we have isolation, we have immutability, and now we have the intelligence to understand, is this a good copy or is this not a good copy? And if it's not a good copy, can I proactively, take care of it and understand that it's going to be clean? So in the event of recovery from the vault, I can do that rather quickly. But immutability, being used as the ultimate tool for, surviving a cyber attack, makes my eyes roll back in my head.
Well, we don't want to do that.
No.
We are almost out of time. So Kevin, before I let you go, what's the big takeaway from our conversation today? What's the message that agencies and other organizations really need to keep in mind as they're trying to deal with this increase, the volume, the veracity, the velocity of attack vectors?
Yeah. So if I were really to wrap it all up and put a bow on it per se, in looking at your defense in depth, the litmus test I use is the insider, right? How resilient are you against an insider? What would you do if you're hit with a 0-day exploit? And do you have any kind of tools that are going to help you find those indicators of compromise that they're in, doing dwell time? So if we look at the insiders and couple back to the beginning, the remote workforce, we really have to define insiders as, not only the compromised user, not only the upset admin, but we have carelessness. I mentioned before, well-meaning users, negligent users, oblivious users. All of those different things need to be defined as an insider, because as we've been talking about, an adversary just needs one hook in and they're in. The second litmus test, as I said before, is the 0-day exploit. Again, your disaster recovery tools, your data protection tools aren't made for that from the use case standpoint, because again, you have to eradicate that attack, right? And there's no way for your identify, protect, and detect tools to be able to find that proactively. So having an area, again, that's isolated, essentially a zero oxygen environment, allows organizations to, forensically eradicate those without affecting the production environment. And then the third one is dwell time. Understand that it exists, understand that it's out there, add to the tools that you already have in terms of, looking for those 20, 25 attack vectors that the adversaries are always using to be able to get in, and then have the way to be able to react to that. So really, as I close it out, it's doable. It is not all doom and gloom, as I said previously. It's not a matter of if, but when.
When the attacks will come, exactly.
Right.
And when they do, you got to be ready for them. So exactly. I think you've laid out a pretty good way for agencies to start thinking about this and continue to think about this, because as you said, it's not a matter of if, it's always a matter of when. Kevin,
and I'm sorry, Jason, I know you're trying to wrap up, but if we can fit in, it needs to be about people, process, and technology, the coordination of all three of those things. You can't just do things in a vacuum. So whether that sticks or not, I just wanted to kind of throw that in. So apologies for cutting you off.
Kevin, this has been a fascinating conversation. I do appreciate your time, but unfortunately we are out of time. So let me thank my guest. Kevin McDonough is an advisory systems engineer at Dell Technologies. Kevin, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you. I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search innovation.